think the initial foundations of this mess, the first International Single Convention on Narcotics in 1961, was based on the so-called science of the day, which was literally little better than reefer madness. When I grew up in the 1970s, I remember our health education films, which were just full of hysteria. You know, kids, if you smoke a joint, you'll have babies that are deformed with cyclops eyes, and that sort of thing. It was just absolutely crazy. And we've learned so much since then. But if you look at how much we've progressed in every area since 1961, the social norms of that period would be considered completely unacceptable today if a politician gave a speech using the language of 1961. If you think how we've advanced in terms of the way we talk about women's issues, people of color, indigenous rights, LGBT issues, and yet when it comes to drug policy, there are those who would like to keep this in a locked box, frozen in time, that everything in 1961 was perfect and the other two conventions that followed. We need not re-examine these things. And every year we're learning so much more. And now that it's become legal to do some cannabis research in many places, we're learning, the amount that we're learning is increasing exponentially. And the idea that we shouldn't go back and revisit these assumptions and the mores of the time, I think is ridiculous. I think there's no single model that's universal or that could be applied to all places, but if you look at the mosaic around the world, bits and pieces of it, people have gotten it right in many different ways in different places. And it's not to say that you can just weave them all together and drop them into a country and adapt to its culture or whatever, but the essence and the lessons that have been learned from around the world are incredibly valuable. This is the one thing I've gotten from travel, is actually seeing some of these places up close and personal. The first safe injection site in North America, in Vancouver, for instance, I helped the mayor lobby on that, to get that in place. He asked me to go, for instance, lobby the Chinatown business community, which is downtown East Side, that's where they were located. And they were originally just so hostile and angry. You know, again, you're dumping your problems on our doorstep. But in fact, that's where the addicts were injecting, in the alleys in Chinatown, right? And they were using rainwater, and they were using, it was just all, you know, it was just a very unsafe, unsanitary condition. Although fairly nice, some of the nicest people I've ever met. Not a scary place. But as a result of Insight, for instance, now the Chinatown business community sees the benefits of it, and they are some of the biggest proponents. That it's cleaned up their neighborhoods, the property values have increased, the tourism is, in every way it's helped, but especially the health outcomes. If you look at what's happening in Portugal in terms of decriminalization, and not only the sky didn't fall, but it got better, you know, sunnier skies. Uruguay is moving forward on cannabis legalization. Uruguay is a great example of a country that never bothered to criminalize possession and individual use to begin with. And so all they did with this new policy of taxing and regulating cannabis is take it out of the black market. They were afraid that criminal gangs would start taking over. And they decided, well, let's bring it into the arms of the state, and so we can regulate this. So nothing has changed, except now that they're depriving illegal groups of revenue. And yet there were still a lot of drug warriors who opposed what Uruguay was doing. You know, they would rather, no, you must give that money back to these criminal groups. So in the United States, of course, state after state, they're legalizing either medical or recreational cannabis. Washington, D.C., where I live, voted by a margin of 70% to legalize adult recreational use. Out of 143 voting precincts, 142 voted in favor of it in Washington, D.C. And the one precinct that voted against it only lost by 9 votes. That is spectacular. And I hope that international media that have bureaus in Washington, D.C. will do stories on this, because not only has the sky not fallen, but the arrest rates, which had been incredibly racially disproportionate, have basically stopped in terms of cannabis harassment, and because they were, you know, more than 90% were African Americans, and yet if you talk to anyone in Washington, D.C., that is not anywhere near a representative amount of cannabis use. And so D.C. is a place where people voted for this not for libertarian reasons or for stoner reasons, but because it was fundamentally about racial and social justice. And so I'm very proud of that, being a D.C. resident. So now it's legal to grow, to use, and to gift, but not to regulate or sell, which is a fluke of Congress. They won't let us do that. But Nothing revolutionary. It's always incremental change. But I think the drug policy tends to evolve in a way that's more like punctuated equilibrium, right? Things coast along for a while, and then something triggers a major change, then it coasts for a little bit and more big change and that sort of thing. And then eventually you get to a better system, eventually. But I think we're at a tipping point. One of these you know, we're at a juncture right now because of legalization in many states in the United States, because of social movements around the world, and because of a almost revolutionary political climate. I mean, this past year, all bets are off in terms of US politics. I've never witnessed anything like this. And the people are angry and they're fed up with the status quo, and amongst those things are the criminal justice system and the war on drugs. So I think we're seeing a lot more change and a lot faster change. And I think that's going to ripple throughout the world. So the UNGASS process, you know, I don't think there's the votes there to change the system fundamentally, but on the other hand, there is definitely the political push to rethink a lot of these things. And that's where it's got to begin. It has to begin somewhere. And so people who say, well, nothing radical is going to come out of UNGASS, that's not the point. The point is to get the ball rolling, and rolling it is. When I first started in drug policy, I worked in places like East Baltimore, some of the most devastated urban landscape you'll see in the United States, particularly in the 90s. And I would come across communities that were just so devastated. There was no hope there. There were no jobs, no access to job training programs, no access to transportation infrastructure for the jobs that might exist in the suburbs. And our response from so many politicians was to say, oh, I see your problem. You have drugs in your community. You need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future or no opportunity. These are not acceptable substitutes for social policy. So they've been scapegoating you know, a chemical boogeyman and saying that's the reason for all your problems, when in fact it's all these other surrounding problems of what I call the PDA problem, poverty, despair, and alienation. And when I travel to places like rural Colombia or you know, drug-producing regions, and I see the same similarities, right? Not in terms of drug use or you know, racial breakdown or whatever, but in terms of people who have been abandoned by the state, who have no access to, you know, we tell them to grow fruits and vegetables, and yet how are they supposed to transport hundreds of kilos of fruits and vegetables on vehicles they don't have, over roads that literally don't exist, to sell in markets, both domestic and export, they can't get access to, and even if they could, to compete against cheap agribusiness imports that we support through our free trade agreements, against which these farmers don't stand a chance. That's why things like Plan Colombia haven't worked in terms of drug policy. You cannot punish your way out of this. And so these farmers are doing things, they're surviving the only way they know how. A lot of these people are colonizers. They've been pushed off their land through 50 years of civil war. Some of them are moving into indigenous territories, which is very problematic, or they're cutting down more rainforest to grow illicit crops. But they do so because they have to. There's no other way, right? So transporting a kilo of coca paste, which they can make on their farms using very simple materials, solves the problem of transportation infrastructure. And so our planners have really failed to take into consideration the realities that people must live in. But our politicians, it seems easy for them to say, you know, just have them grow fruits and vegetables, problem solved, just you know, do that. And these are people, and many of the planners and development experts in Washington and Bogota, they hardly ever get their boots dirty. And until you've been in the mud and realize what these farmers are living through, that they themselves understand very clearly what can be grown in their soils, what can be transported, the kinds of challenges they face in terms of corruption, infrastructure, all these other things, they aren't listened to. And so we get these externally imposed top-down models that have generally always failed. But that's not to say we shouldn't do alternative development. It means that we should do it properly and with consultation. Absolutely. Part of that, you know, is to be an historian. And if you take an historical view, if I were writing a book about the women's suffrage movement 100 years ago, people said, oh, you're crazy, that's never going to happen. And yet, within a generation, it happened. If I were writing a book about the end of empires, people say, oh, empires are the way of the world, this is never going to go away. And yet, within a generation, the empires crumbled. So the only thing that's inevitable is change, and sometimes it's even for the better. And I've been doing this since 1998, and I've seen more positive change in the past 3 or 4 years than I have in the previous 15 years.